Okay. Hello, everybody. If you want to take your seats. Welcome to the Jay's 72nd Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Sue Lutz, and I am a member of the Book Fair Executive Committee. Book Fair is proudly sponsored by the Jay, where you can find your Jewish center. Book Fair would like to thank our literary agent, Nancy and Sam Shammy, sponsor, SAGE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, and supporter, Limud, Michigan, for their support. Thanks to all our generous donors, we are able to present most of our programs for free, and we invite you to become a patron and a sponsor as well. We'd like to thank Schuler Books, our community bookseller partner, for 2023, and extend our gratitude to the entire Book Fair Committee. Your dedication and efforts have made all of this possible. Today is our last day of fantastic authors, and we hope you'll come to all of our events. Please pick up a Book Fair brochure or visit our website. I won't announce the website, but it's in here. Just stay for the day. Please also visit our bookstore after this program. Your wonderful purchases help to support this annual event and allow us to bring these wonderful authors to our community. Additionally, please shop our online bookstore, where our bookshop, and the website is in here, and Book Fair will benefit, and we have a large variety of books. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's special guest. Dr. Howard Markel is the George E. Wantz Distinguished Professor of History of Medicine and Director of the Center for the History of Medicine at the University of Michigan. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, PBS, NewsHour.org, and national radio and television shows. Dr. Markel is the author, co-author, and co-editor of 10 books and has written over 450 articles and book chapters. He has delivered lectures across the U.S. and in Europe, and has spoken at U.S. government agencies, departments, and the White House. His work has been recognized with numerous grants, honors, awards, including a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. A native of Detroit, he earned his bachelor's and medical degrees at the University of Michigan. He completed his pediatrics residency and fellowship and PhD at Johns Hopkins Hospital and Medical School. Following the program, Dr. Markel will be signing copies of his book, The Secret of Life Outside, The Secret of Life, right outside the Janus Chair Gallery. I changed the title. and everybody will want to purchase and read this book. At this time, please silence your cell phones and turn off any devices that light up or make noise. And join me in welcoming Dr. Howard Markel.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, don't ring your bells. I had COVID, ironically, because I study COVID. And I was going to write an article years ago about doctors always seem to die about the disease they specialize or study. And that doesn't seem like a great idea lately to me, but I got COVID. I was in Cambridge University having a great time. A lot of this book takes place there. And I got it promptly when I came home, either from the human petri dish that is Heathrow or Metro Detroit. And then I developed long COVID, and I was very foggy for a long time. And you'll still kind of hear it, so I apologize. But if there's a bell, I'll just go off into Pavlovian hell. Okay, anyway. The Secret of Life. It's an ironic title if you read the book. Supposedly, in James Watson's famous best-selling book that I'll talk a little bit about called The Double Helix, which a lot of us read. I read as an 18-year-old. I bought a used copy at Ulrich's Books, which is not even there, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in 1978 to a teenage boy, and I articulate boy. I found the book kind of funny and all that. I didn't really get to know. I want to talk mostly about Rosalind Franklin today, but I didn't get because of where we are and all that. But I didn't really get to know this story till much later. My two daughters, one who is at Oxford now, and the other who's a fresh person at Smith, asked me about Rosalind Franklin got a raw deal, and all I remembered. Because I do the history of medicine, I study epidemics, I study quarantine. I didn't know that other than reading the Double Helix. I said, well, we have to see what the data shows, what the archives show. I was hesitant. I did not know. It was kind of like a male patriarchal kind of protectorate thing, whatever. I can shorten this lecture to about like 2 seconds. She got a raw deal. She got a raw deal. So let's talk a little bit about that. The last time I gave this lecture was actually just before leaving Cambridge at Churchill College, and Rosalind Franklin's little sister, Jennifer Glynn, who's about 94 right now, came. And I got one of the nicest compliments of all from her because she's a very, very proper person, not a huggy kind of, even though this is like a Jewish mom, Jewish grandmother, and I learned a lot about Rosalind by getting to know Jennifer. Anyway, Jennifer liked to talk, and she was really difficult to please, so hopefully I can recreate that just a bit. Nope, sorry. Well, who were the people in this, the dramatis personae, to be, perfectly Shakespearean about all this. And, there were three real centers at the time. It's hard to imagine in 1950, 51, how primordial science was. There was no molecular biology. Genetics was Mendelian, or worse, it was eugenic misapplications to it. But the idea of solving the so-called secret of life, which is supposedly in the book Francis Crick said as they winged into the Eagle Pub, which is about 100 feet, 110 feet from the Cavendish physics lab, I counted. And Crick said he never said that, of course. And finally I got Watson, who I got to spend time with. He admitted, no, he never did say that, but he should have said that. He would have said that. And everyone who read that believed he said that. And so the reason why I sardonically call this book The Secret of Life, and I'm telling you like this in a play or a movie, because there are a lot of fictions, there's a lot of layers here, there are a lot of stories, and a lot of high stakes. As high as the Nobel Prize, and having institutes named after you and not named after you for other reasons, and so on. So it's really one of the high stakes games in it. But at the time in in the history of science, I should say, but in 1950, no one knew what DNA did. No one knew DNA. Proteins, amino acids were thought to be much more intelligent. DNA was considered a dumb molecule because it only had 4 nucleotides, and no one knew its structure, of course, and no one really thought much of its structure. But after World War II, physicists were like the top of the pecking order of solvers, of discoverers. And think about, what went on before that, 1900 to 1950, in terms of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, quantum chemistry, which is really just a hop, skip, and a jump from molecular biology. Biophysics was a lot of the founders of molecular biology. People who were physicists who were tired of working on the bomb after the Manhattan Project, post-World War II, changed their whole research direction from, say, like steady state physics to biophysics, because it was so horrible to see what their work had wrought. Most famously, of course, Albert Einstein talked about this and wrote about this as well. So we have King's College in London, where there's Rosalind Franklin and supposedly her colleague Maurice Wilkins. Maurice Wilkins was so shy he would talk to people like that, you know. And he had some women issues. I met his granddaughter, and she agreed. He was my grandfather, but he was odd. And he never had a female graduate student, by the way. Now, at Caltech, we'll talk just briefly about him later, but is Linus Pauling, who's the smartest, greatest chemist in the world. It's written on the hydrogen bond, if you know anything about chemistry. He was worked with Niels Bohr, et cetera. But if anyone was going to solve, by the way, the structure of amino acids, if anyone was going to solve it, if you were going to bet on anybody, it would be him. At Caltech, he had a great lab, he had great colleagues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at Cambridge were these two upstarts, one an American biologist, a microbiologist from Chicago, but by way of Indiana University, named James Watson, one of the most ambitious people ever to walk the face of the earth, certainly in the history of science. Always knew, even though he was gangly and weird, and he remains weird to this day, and he has bulging eyes and does certain things, and he says certain things, and not just about African Americans, most infamously, where he talked about the intelligence difference. He said some nasty things about Jewish people. I've known him for 30, 40 years. So this is part of his being. And even if you look at his letters at home to his mom and dad, when he's like 20, 21, he's describing the dirty Jews in Brooklyn, and describes Naples as, when he went there for a visit, as one of the worse than the Negro section in South Chicago. So, people don't just become bigots and racists. It's like the old Rodgers and Hammerstein song, "You've got to be carefully taught." Double Helix, it's really more of a novel than a document of history, and that's what why I wanted to write about it. It's such an icon of scientific reporting. I bet, how many people in the room have read the Double Helix? Quite a few. The rest I'm related to, and they're not going to buy a book anyway. So a nephew said, "Hey, Uncle Howard, can I have a free book?" I go, "Well, then I got to pay for it." Oh, okay. So anyway. The Double Helix is still in print. It's over 1 million copies. And Mrs. Franklin, Rosalind's mother, Muriel, and there's letters that I uncovered, said, "I wish my daughter had never been remembered at all, instead of the way she was remembered by millions of us who read that book. Particularly if you read that book before, I don't know, at least before the turn of the last century, the 90s, but 80s, certainly." And it was a cartoon figure. She's like this, shrew, and he calls her nasty things. And even Rosie, no one called Rosalind Franklin Rosie. It was always Rosalind. So that book became quite famous. And of course, he won the Nobel with Crick and with Wilkins in 1962. They didn't discover, by the way, Watson Crick didn't discover DNA. A chemist named Friedrich Miescher did that in 1869, but nobody knew what it was. Let me just go. This is King's College, where Franklin worked and was really very much frozen out by Wilkins. Wilkins thought she was hired to be his assistant. She was actually, when she was hired by the head physicist who had this big biophysics grant to study DNA, and that was the big British push, she was one of the best X-ray diffraction specialists in the world. Very arcane method, where you're beaming X-rays off of a specimen. It's particularly was well worked out for inorganic chemical substances because they're still you get like a piece of rock salt. DNA, if you can get a pure DNA sample, which they could, is like snot. Okay, like really gross snot, really tenacious gross snot that was held between the X-ray things with literally with a paper clip. That's how rudimentary this was. And then you're bombarding it with a plate, and you're taking at different angles, and then you're using all that data through pre-computer abacus kind of computations that it's like putting your head through a sieve, your brain through a sieve, and then trying to refigure it out. She was one of those people. So, I'm not your assistant. And she was one of women in science leaders. If you think about this, is 1951, to be she was immediately her good. It was clear she was going to be cast out. Okay, I've been in academia a long time, as this man and boy I say now, for over 40 years. We do some pretty nasty things to people. Not we, they. They do, but you know what I mean. And she got frozen out. She ultimately went to a different college at the University of London called Birkbeck. But it was probably and her boss, their boss, could have John Randall could have just sat them down and said, "This is what you're going to do because you're good at this, and this is what you're going to do because you're good at this." Because Wilkins was not an X-ray diffraction physicist. But no, they didn't. So I call it one of the biggest human resources snafus in the history of science. But I hate human resources. I hate using that term because they're not human and they're not a resource. And anyway, that's another story. This is John Randall, who ran the lab, but was too, in the air to actually do anything to fix it. And later on, in an interview, regretted his lack of getting involved. And this is the room. I love to go to the places I'm writing about. A sense of place is very important to me, and I hope to my readers. And so this is actually, where that little door is open is her little hutch where she worked in the basement of that building I showed you at King's College, right off the Strand. There I'd call it. And now, let's see if I can. Now, there was a meeting where Watson met Wilkins at the Naples Zoological Station. So that book took me to Naples, which I wish it was Siena, But the book took me to a lot of places, including Stockholm. Well, we can talk about that too. But I went there, and he met Wilkins giving a talk, and that's where everything became clear that Watson wanted to work on DNA and knew that biophysics was the way. I talk about that in the book quite a bit, and we can talk about it at question time, but I want to get more into Rosalind. He actually, Watson, by the way, I can't help but show you something about his character. His younger sister was there, all prim and proper in a pink gingham dress, and Watson was so eager to get a gig with Wilkins, he tried to, I don't know how to say it pleasantly, pimp his sister out. Didn't you say that? You said it first. Trigger alert. Wilkins just didn't want that, but that they did it at Paestum, which is, if you ever have the chance and you're ever near Naples, it's about 120 miles. It's one of the best Greco temples in Italy. What's really interesting, I found this letter actually, an archivist helped me find a letter. And one of the reasons why historians go to archives, I can't convince my dean this, well, can't you get it online? Well, no, it's like 2%, no, it's online. The reason why you go is because you're looking at a collection, but you're also talking to the archivist who knows far more about the collection than you ever will. And they'll point out, you should look at this file or that file, and you never would. Some of the best stuff I've ever gotten is by chatting up an archivist. So great archivist at the American Philosophical Society, which is, Ben Franklin's library and such, showed me this. And so Wilkins is writing to another colleague, a man named Erwin Chargaff, and if there's any scientists in the room, Chargaff's rules, A to T, C to G. He was a biochemist, and Chargaff was at Columbia, but he was giving Wilkins some samples of DNA. You can't really see it well, but here's a helix, and it says nucleotide bases right there, okay? And this is a year before, by the way, that Watson and Crick had their brains. And then you see, here, a couple of X-ray diffractions he did that has what's like a Maltese cross, they call it. And they're not, those are just, pen drawings, but the Maltese cross later on, if you remember the double helix, is what Wilkins showed, a much better version that Rosalind did, and it's a helix, because it is. That would, if you knew that much X-ray diffraction, you would know that represents, whether it was a double or a quadruple or a triple, they had to figure that out later on. But Wilkins knew all of this stuff a year before and couldn't put 2 and 2 to equal 4. And, the big rap, when I give this lecture, I hate giving this lecture to gray-haired men who are scientists who knew Watson, because they defend it. And so the gymnastics, the mental gymnastics they put themselves through to, well, as Watson told me, I said, if in a perfect world, what if, 2 of you got it for physics and 2 of you got it for medicine, because only 3 can share one award. And one of them was Rosalind Franklin, and she was alive, because you got to be alive to get the Nobel. Last time I read it, the rules, you don't get the Nobel for not being able to interpret your data. And he's looking at me with his bulging eyes and his desk, and then his Nobel Prize is literally behind his head. Yeah. And later on, I was on the BBC for another Nobel laureate, Luc Montagnier, who died, even though he was a co-discoverer of HIV. He was anti-vax, and he died of COVID. And so and I said, well, just because you know everything about one thing, you get a Nobel Prize in one thing, doesn't mean you know everything, Nobel Prize. But anyway, I don't know why I was going on to this. But the point is that when I asked Watson, well, what about this letter? He couldn't figure it out either. He said, yeah, but we all liked Morris. No old boy society there. The time I spent with Watson was like the biggest whale I've ever had. I've been interviewing people for years. I used to do it for the New York Times. It was a pretty cagey people, but Watson was like, Ahab and somebody else. What do I do? I go backward. No, I think it's dead. Can you do the next slide? Oh, so Cambridge. This is where I spent last year and walked by those all the time. So Watson got himself off to Cambridge and met Crick, who was a 35-year-old graduate student, a ne'er-do-well, who was brilliant. But nobody wanted to talk to him because he'd figure out your problem before you would, and then he'd want his name on your paper. And his boss, Lawrence Bragg, who was the only father-son Nobel Prize for physics. The Cavendish physics labs, where Rutherford, split the atom, and J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. I mean, it's like the Johns Hopkins of physics, And Lawrence Bragg hated Crick, and so he moved him all the way down the hall, because he didn't want to be near this guy. But he had a very strong laugh too. And that's how Watson and Crick were sharing this little room that is now all but ripped down. And I'll show you a picture of what it looks like in a bit. Next slide. Bragg, next slide. There's the Cavendish. That's where they exited. If you read the beginning of my book, I try to make it very cinematic. They're exiting. They have discovered, or figured out the double helix, which is quite remarkable. And the Austin wing, where they were. Next slide, which was right behind it. And this was their office, which they shared with two others, Linus Pauling's son, Peter, which there's, the plot thickens with him, too, and a guy named Jerry Donahue, and we can get into that later, but it was critical to the story that they're there in terms of what they knew. But it's just a little office because, it's not like they're doing lab work. It was all like thinking about it, okay? Next slide. And I used to walk right down here. I tried to do a selfie that looked like that, but it never came out that way. Next slide. This is just part of the whole physics department, but they're just so impossibly young. And, we were all very young, too, at one time. Next slide. Where he lived, Clare College. Next slide. That's Linus Pauling, and he was on their chase, but he went hopelessly awry. But we can talk about that as a question. Next slide. Keep going. Keep going. He actually proposed a triple helix, which was, that wasn't even an acid, and DNA is a nucleic acid. Next slide. Rosalind Franklin. This is in Montalcino. I know this this wall very well. I've cast my body over it and looked. And she was really a remarkable woman. She was just so very practical, able to compartmentalize different parts of her life. And I talk about that, when she's in her home. In fact, I think the next slide is her home. No, well, that's her in Paris. Next slide. Yeah. So this is where she lived in the Kensington area of London. I snuck in there. My students think that's really creepy. But it's not like I'm stalking Rosalind Franklin. It just helps me understand, where she lived. And actually verified something that Jennifer told me. In one of the biographies of Rosalind, it says that her apartment was a 2-bedroom apartment. And Jennifer, no, it was a 1-bedroom. And sure enough, Jennifer was right. So, that's the lengths to which I go. That's why they pay me the big buck. By the way, writing books it's the stupidest business for a Jewish boy to go into. It's like, my whole goal is be on the radio, write for newspapers, and be a printed author. And these were all like formed like in the 80s, 70s. It's like being a dinosaur. Nobody reads. Nobody writes. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't know why I went on it. So keep going. So she was just this brilliant person. She went to she got her degree at Cambridge. She had a real jerk for a PhD advisor that you would get in trouble for today. She was in the war effort and was studying coal. Now, that sounds weird, but the X-ray diffraction of some forms of coal versus others tells you what burns better or more efficiently, and that's a big deal in World War II when there's limited sources of that, and that's the major source of fuel. She then went to Paris at a very famous X-ray diffraction lab that was filled with lots of, ironically, Jewish emigres, and a lot of other people from France and Italy and what have you. And the place was very operatic, it's described. They had fights, they had spats, they had dinners, they probably even had affairs. When she went to the King's College place, it was like, very prim and proper. And having spent a year with the Brits, I felt like, you ever see Woody Allen's Annie Hall? And he's having dinner with Annie's family, and he's in Payas, and like, the whole year I felt like that. No, I mean, you really are aware, of that. So, so being a Jewish woman going into physical chemistry and physics, you know. This is tough, tough stuff, you know. And you can go through her files, her human resource, not human, but, you know, it's in her papers of, you know, the deals, what she was supposed to study and so on. And she just never had the backing of John Randall. And Morris Wilkins effectively froze her out, so she had to leave. Now, one of the things my very senior colleagues who are like, you know, like these guys who are either people I know I've met on this journey who are either Nobelists or Nobel wannabes or, you know, founding fathers in molecular biology. And I met a lot of these at Cambridge and at some fancy clubs where I was speaking on this in London, and quite a few 90-odd-year-olds at Harvard too. But it's always, you know, to support Jim Watson. And, you know, the reality is that, well, Jim Watson didn't steal her data per se. You know, if I show you this picture, what was it a picture of? Yeah. Yeah, right. You're not going to forget that once you see that. What was more incredible, and I go through this in detail, it took me a year and a half to learn the physics. Physics almost, one of my former medical school classmates who was one of the smartest kids in the class is there, so I'm going to admit physics was my bête noire. So I had to learn all this stuff. But the point is that she wrote a progress report, about 11 paragraphs. They all wrote progress reports for these big grants. It went to the Cambridge head of that grant that was doing, their lane was hemoglobin. You know, their NIH, called the Medical Research Council, MRC, was like, King's does DNA, Cambridge does hemoglobin and myoglobin, Leeds does something else, et cetera. And that was the way it was done back then. And you could interlope in your own lab, but you did not change lanes, you know, which Watson was doing, of course, all the time. But when I asked these people, you know, what if we called it, you know, she can't get the Nobel because she was already gone. She died at 38 of ovarian cancer. That's what makes Watson's book in 1962, she died in 1958, especially cruel, especially hostile, especially misogynistic, just mean, monstrous. I've been writing, I don't know, I've published over 1 million words. I don't care how good the story is, you know. But it was invented too. I mean, was she difficult? Yeah, so were they. They were weirdos too, you know. But when I asked, what if they just called it the Watson-Crick-Franklin model? Because those 11 paragraphs, which their boss showed them, and shouldn't have really, and he went through a bunch of mental gymnastics that I go through in the book and some documents to show he was lying too, that Crick will tell you that's where the menorah candle started lighting. It was the 8th day, and you could see it all. Because it wasn't just the picture. She had all the coordinates, the pitch, the angles, the stuff that none of us would figure out. Rob might, but do you remember any of that? Kind of, yeah. You know, all this kind of stuff that's really important. That's really the theft. And I call it the biggest ripoff in the history of science. Next slide. Oh, that's the famous 51, where Watson could never unsee it. And you know, even that story is very misogynist. How are we doing on time, by the way? Are we okay? What? Okay, I'm like a cantor on Yom Kippur. I can vamp long and short depending on. But anyway, that's the famous 51 that Wilkins showed her. Next slide. Oh, this is Jennifer Glynn, who I got to know, and that's her husband who passed away, Ian Glynn. I was at high table at Trinity College with another colleague, and this elderly woman, she said, what are you working on? And at that time, I was working on the DNA book, and I said, well, I'm writing about the DNA double helix and Rosalind Franklin. Well, that's my sister. What are the odds of that? I mean, which is like, that's why I keep writing. You know? And it's also why I write nonfiction, because I would never invent something like that. Next slide, I think. The Eagle Pub has good bangers and mash, if you ever are there, where everything happened. And that's where they ate. These are just, classic pictures of Watson and Crick. Keep going. The famous paper, but the next paper was by Wilkins, and it was the same nonsense he gave at Naples, and then a very, very, very detailed paper by Rosalind Franklin that no one could understand unless you were like that smart and focused, specialized. You know what I mean? It was that difficult, which also adds to this. The Watson and Crick paper is about, I think, 940 words, 840 words, I forget. Blame it on the COVID, but about 900 words, all in declarative sentences, not a scintilla of data. It's all theoretical. It was really Rosalind Franklin's data. But physicists then thought that the theoreticians, the Albert Einsteins, the Bohrs, the Braggs, whoever, they were the real physicists, and the data people were grunts. That's why women did it back then, too. But doesn't that seem all backwards to the progress of science? You got to have data. Next slide. And that's the model they built, but it was all based on Rosalind's data. And the Nobel Prize. I think I'd love to hear what you have to say or questions you might ask. So the sad conclusion is that even though they won the Nobel, she was already gone for 4 years, but was doing some remarkable work on polio virus, for example. I asked Jim Watson, I kept pumping him, like when you're interviewing somebody, it's really a doctor's game too. Like, for example, if you suspect somebody being alcoholic, okay, and they like beer, you say, so what are you putting away? A case of beer a day? Oh no, it's only 2 6-packs. So you figure out ways to ask people, and I just gave that away. So, but you figure out ways too, as when you're doing journalism or history or oral history. But he was cagey in a big whale, and I said, well, I mean, if you had to do all over again, I mean, what would you say to Rosalind? And he went into this reverie. It was weird, as if he was back in 1953. She was never nice. She was never very nice to me, at least. And this was an immature man. If you read any of his comments towards women and stuff, well into his 90s, it's not sophisticated. Let me put it that way. So he was still that boy, hurt, and he said, well, but perhaps it was not exactly honorable. And then he skittered away. At least it wasn't fair to Morris, something like that. But I had it on tape. And as I left his office, I was literally about 4 feet. I was walking literally on air. I mean, it was a great thing. But here's the story about Rosalind, is that historians keep rewriting things. And this book would not have been possible to have written in 1978, I think, if I were an adult then when I picked up the double helix. Lots of changes have occurred. But it's so incredible that the families, the Franklin family especially, which was a big deal English family, by the way, right, just like the Our Crowd version in New York, but the view of history is long, and to me it is impossible to look at all of the stuff that I looked at and present to you, and I hope in a non-biased fashion. If I am biased, I'll tell you in the text. I'll say, some might say, or so, but I don't fake those kinds of things. But the point is that it is the Watson-Crick-Franklin model. Period. Stop. So I'll stop there. And Yeah.
in the audience, so please raise your hand, and if you have a question, and if you could repeat the question, just so everybody, oh, okay, we can take this around. Okay.
Were there inklings of this before you wrote the book?
Inklings.
I mean, were they published somewhere, or did people speak out about it?
You know, yes. I mean, I didn't just. Were there inklings of this case, this history, before I got to it? Absolutely, and there's a long literature. Some of it really detailed, and some of it really quite even primary sources. Like in 1975, Rosalind Franklin's friend Ann Sayer wrote a biography of Franklin, and has tons of interviews in her papers in, of all places, Baltimore County, Maryland. It's very much a feminist, 1975 of its time kind of a book. There is another biography of Franklin as well. There's lots of pro-Watson books as well, and Watson himself, before his precipitous fall from grace a few years ago because of his racist rants. He wrote books, with Alfred Knopf, great publisher, there for 20 years, big deal publisher, so he was his own best PR. Nothing smells like success like a Nobel Prize. So, but I felt there was a lot more that hadn't been uncovered. And throughout my career, I've made a living at going deeper than most people do. That's why I went to Naples. No one's ever done that, and found really, really great stuff. Going to Baltimore County, where the American Society of Microbiologists papers are, I mean, that's pretty arcane. I mean, I used to live, sadly, I used to live like an hour from there when I lived there, but not when I needed the archive. So you keep searching. Where does the maze take you? And I found, I think, a lot of new stuff. I mean, the book I'm coming out with in June on Darwin, because I was at Cambridge last year, and his papers were 900 feet from my college, and I'm basically lazy, physically lazy. Especially exercise. It's like, who said this? I think maybe in Robert Benchley, but whenever I get the urge to exercise, I lie down and wait till it goes away. But even with this Darwin book, there's a Darwin industry. I found that a lot of people were using secondary sources of this quote or that quote, but not going the next 3 lines in that quote that was even better. You know what I mean? So you can always do a deep dive, I think, and find more if you're looking. So, but of all the books I've ever written, and I wrote it mostly during COVID. And I was really busy with COVID because of the work I've done with flattening the curve. So in the morning I write, generally at 5 a.m. to about 10 or so. And then, I'd had to do interviews and stuff every day during COVID, which, poor me. It was fun, don't get me wrong. I had a great pandemic, if you study pandemics, when the world does badly, I do well. Yeah. I wish to God my father was alive and I could convince him I made a living doing what I do. No, he knew that. But anyway, you can always find more stuff, And by the way, when you sell a book to a publisher, if you can't convince them there's new stuff, why do the book? So there's new stuff. Trust me. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm a pathologist. This is
I'm sorry.
I'm a pathologist. This is a deep dive question for you. She's 38. She's Jewish. She dies of ovarian cancer, which is pretty young. Did she have the BRCA gene? Do we know? I mean, it's
well, we don't know, but it does run in the Franklin family.
Okay. Do we know more about the ovarian cancer that she had, or maybe that's
no?
Cares
They have similar HIPAA laws, so there's no way I'll ever be able to get there. The family is wonderful, and I had a Pesach with them. In fact, Jennifer's daughter is a spitting image of Rosalind Franklin. It was spooky. I kept looking at her. I thought,
Right.
I don't want to date you. That would have been wild though. But the BRCA gene does run in the family. Leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions?
This young lady.
So I, not that long ago, saw a play about Rosalind Franklin
Yeah.
called The Double Helix, I think.
No, it was Photo 51, I think.
Yes, Photo 51, thank you. How would that compare to the research you did?
Do I have to repeat that question? For a whole year, the people who are making the movie out of that dangled my book as an option for a movie or a series. So I'm a little sensitive about that topic. Sorry about that. No, don't apologize. I've been almost famous like a dozen times. I'm used to this. Anyway, the play is fictional and there's some fictional relationships at the end, like her love interest with Don Casper, who not only he but also Jennifer denied they were deep, deep good friends, but not physical lovers or anything like that. I write history. See, I'm a narrative historian. I got into it not to give theories or give long treatises. I like finding out and telling stories, and so.
The way they portrayed her in the play, how real to what you...
Well, I haven't seen the version you've seen, so I can't. I don't know which version you saw. Nicole Kidman did it. I mean, she could play me anytime. Yeah, so I mean, it was a London play several years ago with her, and she's in the production company. But how did Rosalind?
Their portrayal of Rosalind,
Yeah,
how did it compare to what you...
I can tell you this: the family is not pleased with that, but they did like my book, the whole family.
Yeah, I'd like to take you a little bit afield, if I may. We've seen in this country, with our reaction, with the dealing with COVID, with the anti-vax movement, which is terrifying, with how poorly we deal with climate change. What should we be doing in education so that people can accept science, let's put it that way, and I'll let you expand it or not.
Yeah, thank you. What can we do to what can we do basically to teach the community, starting here but beyond, about the power of science, the power of medicine, particularly the value, the wonders of vaccines. I mean, COVID vaccine has been tested. Over 1 billion arms have had it. You know what I mean? So it's been tested more than any vaccine in human history. I spent so much of my time when I wrote for the Times for about 11 years, and I did a lot of Science Friday too, and I spent a lot of my life as a public intellectual trying to explain things. And there's a real fulcrum here between pre-Trump. I don't want to get into politics, but especially pre-Trump. It starts before then. You could say it begins in Gingrich or even earlier, but the deification of the egghead. And the whole notion of, your news is fake news, my news is right news. Your science is deadly science, my science, I can invent it. So in the olden days, my job was easy because I could say, well, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts, okay? Yeah, that's why I'm hoping my Darwin book gets banned, because Does any librarians here who can do that? That would be so cool. But anyway, it's really hard in this day and age. When somebody like my friend Tony Fauci is called like a Nazi, and that he's a public servant bar none that I've ever met, that he's making money, off the, news is so atomized, and the internet is so bizarre, and cable is so bizarre. It's really tough. Really tough. Hi.
I have a question.
Was her family supportive of her career choice and her choice to study science?
That's a
and-
great question. Did anyone hear that? Yes and no. So it was a very educated family. It was a banker family, as well as they owned a major publishing house. They were, well-to-do. They didn't live high on the hog, but they were well-to-do, the whole family. And both she and Jennifer went to Cambridge at Newnham College. Jennifer became a historian, and Rosalind did physical chemistry and physics. Her father didn't always understand. He was a Jewish papa, banker, but think about it 100 years ago. Okay, think about your dad, and then go back a generation or two. So what women's roles were. So when World War II came, he thought Rosalind would be better suited rolling bandages. Literally said that, than the very specialized work she was doing with her science. Later on, and especially in Muriel, her mom's view, that buffered, and they had great respect for what she did. They were a close family. She liked to cook, for example. She cooked for her father-in-law. So it was, if you look at the Ann Sayer book, it's like she was discouraged, and that narrative, it's not quite. It's much softer than that. Having said that, it wasn't, easy. Yeah.
Thank you for the book. It's a great book. Enjoying it. My question.
A great Christmas, Hanukkah gift.
It's
There's
Hanukkah
8
gift,
days.
right? Yeah.
You have at least 8 friends.
Yes.
Let's talk.
Whose insight it was to apply X-ray crystallography to organic matter?
That's a great question. Who had the idea? Because if you study chemistry, like sodium chloride, salt, is crystalline, so it's stationary. So if you're bouncing X-rays off of it, you get a much more steady diffraction pattern from which you can do the math, the computation. When it's like a little rubbery kind of piece of snot, it could alter, the air could blow on it. You could move, as you move your X-ray machine and all these things, you could disturb it. So it was a big jump. But because they had figured out so much from the, I think it's 1915 that the Braggs get it for they got it for X-ray crystallography on, inorganic crystals. So I think that's 1915. It's during the Great War, at least, I know that. Well, around, after World War I, they're starting to turn to organic material, particularly fibers, like wool fibers. Because that is a big business in Britain at the time, So, and then it's a hop, skip, and a jump to other types of organic material. These are great questions. These are,
You mentioned that she studied the polio virus. Did she have any involvement in the development of the vaccine?
No, not with the vaccine, but it is interesting. That Watson, because he really was doing a double kind of deal with his fellowship. He was supposed to be in Copenhagen, and he went to Cambridge, and the National Research Council swatted him by taking 6 months away from his salary. So he too was funded by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, March of Dimes. Fascinating, from 1950 to 55. DNA and the Salk vaccine, and then by 63, the Sabin vaccine for polio. But what she was doing really was the structure of the polio, and in the 50s they were still working on that. They had gotten the various strains by then, but they wanted the exact structures. There's a similar story with insulin. Insulin was discovered, which is the next book I'm going to be writing about, discovery of it. It's covered in 22, but it's not till, I think, 48 when Dorothy Hodgkins at Oxford gets the biochemical structure. So there's a lag time there.
Okay, the last question will be mine. And then Howard will be signing his book outside the gallery, and everybody's Agreed. Everybody wants to buy it for themselves, for their children, for their family. So, and we'll find out probably if we read the book. Was it her discipline with data? Would you say she was a genius? What are your quick thoughts with that?
Boy, genius is a really tough word to apply. I think it's over-applied. I'm not qualified to say. In some respects, Watson was a genius at organization, you might say. He organized the National Human Genome Center at NIH. He organized Cold Spring Harbor, blah, 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 blah. She was just incredibly good at a physical craft, because there was physical issues that you had to do. Mathematical, because there's not computers. You're using this weird kind of abacus to do it. And having three-dimensional thoughts. I don't know about you, but I'm quite two-dimensional. I'm right and you're wrong. And but think about that. I'm gonna write that one down. Crick could see that way too. Most of us can't see that. So she was brilliant. She was special. And I think she was also had to be very tough in that environment, because for her, one little error, they're all there to, and I talk about this, one little error, it wasn't just her being slow. And I love, Watson told me, well, she didn't have any friends, she didn't work with anybody. Yeah, well, you ostracized her. I mean, it's like, what do you expect? So, but I think she's a remarkable person.
Thank you. So now we're going to get your book, and he'll sign it, and we all want to be there for The Joy of Costco, a treasure hunt from A to Z with authors David and Susan Schwartz. See you next time.